All right, we're going to continue talking about influenza virus infections. Um, Now, as you probably realize, the influenza viruses have the ability to change more so than most other viruses. They are continually undergoing change, and the type of virus that is infecting large groups of population changes annually. The reason for this is there are two genetic mechanisms operating. One is called antigenic drift, and is the more common ongoing process in which mutations are occurring in the genes coding for the hemagglutinin and neuraminidase protein spikes on the surface envelope. High mutation rates, or higher than average mutation rates, are in fact characteristic of RNA viruses. They may involve only a single amino acid change, as you know from what we've discussed about mutations in the past, but it can be enough to allow the virus to avoid whatever previous mucosal IgA class antibodies that a person may have due to previous flu infections or previous flu vaccinations. So a person could have immunity, in fact, to quite a few different types of flu virus, quite a few different variants of the flu, but with a new mutation, it's a whole new ball game. They don't have any immunity and are susceptible. The other major genetic mechanism that's operating in influenza viruses is antigenic shift. Now, as opposed to antigenic drift, which causes some small changes, antigenic drift often involves quite major changes in the H and N hemagglutinin and neuraminidase protein spikes on the envelope. They are large enough changes that any previous immunity is completely ineffective. With drift, there is maybe some effect, but also there's enough change in the virus so that it is a much larger proportion of the population that's susceptible, and often it is enough to cause an epidemic outbreak. These large changes that occur with antigenic shift are due to the fact that if the same cell is infected with two different strains of the virus, the virus takes over the machinery of the cell, of the host cell, and starts to produce viral nucleic acids, in this case RNA, and viral proteins. And then they assemble, and the assembly can be a mixture of, you can get gene recombination because the two viruses are in the same cell. Now, the thing about influenza virus is that it can infect animals and humans, and in many parts of the world, people are in close association with animals. They may live in the same building as an animal, the animals on the ground floor and people above. People who work with large numbers of animals are constantly being exposed to the viruses that infect them. So in farm workers, in parts of the world where animals are living in close association with people, it is quite conceivable to get two viruses, one animal in origin and two influenza viruses, one animal in origin and one human in origin, to cause a co-infection at the same time in one individual, and you get a genetic recombination, and quite a new, different type of influenza virus emerges from that. The same process could in fact happen in an animal catching a human virus from one of the humans, an infected human who works with the animals, and the animal has influenza virus, an animal form. These are the kind of this is the kind of mechanism. This genetic recombination mechanism is the kind of mechanism that results in antigenic shift, a major shift in the antigen characteristics of the surface proteins, and is responsible for worldwide pandemics of influenza. Now, some of these are listed here. We had a large number of them, and you can see that there are different variants of the hemagglutinin and neuraminidase, H3N2, H1N1, and H2N2. There was an outbreak of, I believe, H1N1, N1 not too long ago in 2009 or 2010. And it was quite well handled and nipped in the bud by quick response and widespread vaccination drive. But every year, the flu influenza viruses that are going around and causing the most infections are identified, and vaccines are developed, and the most susceptible populations hopefully are getting a very high vaccination rate, and other people also hopefully do get vaccinated. There are some strains that are particularly lethal. H5N1 is a bird strain which has only infected a few humans, but has had a very high fatality rate. They monitor populations of birds in commercial facilities and markets, on large agricultural production farms, and if even one case is detected of H5N1, they'll kill all of the animals in that facility. Because in the end, even though that's an expensive proposition, the proposition of an outbreak is way more has way more consequences in terms of fatalities and expense and effect on the whole world human population. Well, some people think that flu, they say, oh, I had a bit of a stomach flu, or oh, I had some flu the last week. Well, no, first of all, there is no stomach flu. Flu is a respiratory infection. It infects the respiratory tract. It does not infect the digestive system, and it is not a little bit. When you have the flu, there's chills, fever, headache, muscle ache. It can really debilitate a person so that they're lying in bed for quite a few days, and if they're strong enough, then they'll survive it and recover. But otherwise, it has a fairly high mortality rate among infected individuals. There were 3,657 deaths in the 2018 to 19 season in Canada. There's 50 to 70,000 deaths roughly per year in the United States. Perhaps that reflects a higher vaccination rate among susceptible populations in Canada. I don't know. Our population is about 1/10 of the United States, so you would expect 36,000 roughly, but their mortality rate, their death rate is higher. Mortality is about 1% due to secondary bacterial infections. And this next point that is brought up here is an important part of the spread of these diseases. About 33%, about a third of the infections are asymptomatic. So someone can have it and be carrying it and be shedding influenza virus and yet have no symptoms, and therefore, is out in public, coughing, sneezing, talking, laughing on the elevator, giving others influenza. So vaccination is key. So each year, the World Health Organization convenes two technical consultation meetings, one in February or March, and another in September, to recommend which strains of influenza viruses should be included in the influenza vaccines being developed for the upcoming season. The February-March meeting is to decide which ones should be included in vaccines for the Northern Hemisphere, which will be developed over the next 6 to 8 months and start to be given in October, November of that year. And in September, they meet and determine which strains should be included in the vaccine being developed for the Southern Hemisphere. And that's developed over the next 6 to 8 months and starts to be delivered, vaccinated into people in the Southern Hemisphere in the spring, in what is our spring and early summer, but their fall and early winter. Fall and early winter in the Southern Hemisphere, the southern part of the Earth, occurs when we have our spring and summer, and vice versa. And so they look at what was the most frequently encountered strains in people who caught the influenza, and which ones are most commonly going around. The 2018 vaccine contained these 4 strains of influenza virus in the vaccine. 2 type A's and type B. Some preparations also contain a second type B. And then for 2019 season, these 2 type A viruses and influenza viruses and these 2 type B. Sometimes there's overlap from year to year. Here you see this one here is also being used here. But the type A's have completely changed because when it was decided in February and March of 2019 which strains would be used to develop the vaccine for fall 2019 for the Northern Hemisphere, these 2 were the ones that were going around most commonly in the Southern Hemisphere in the previous season. So they were the ones that were most likely to start occurring in the fall season in the Northern Hemisphere. And so things evolve year by year, and different vaccines are prepared to prevent the most likely infection with the most likely strains that will be going around. Vaccines are strongly recommended for high-risk individuals, typically, and those recommendations can change from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So from one province to the next, there may be slight differences. But in general, they follow these kind of recommendations. I certainly wouldn't want you to learn them. They shift regularly. But people at high risk of serious illness from influenza are the ones who are recommended to receive the virus. And that includes children, older people, pregnant women, for different very valid reasons why a person should get themselves vaccinated, because they are at high risk to develop a really serious case of influenza if they catch it. Also, people who are more likely to transmit or spread it to those who are high risk, and that includes, people who work with individuals in these populations. So doctors, nurses, care providers, caregivers, daycare staff, etc. They work with people who are at high risk, and so they might transmit it to them. So it's always recommended that they get it also. And then others, people who work with animals, especially live chickens and pigs and poultry, ducks, geese, it's recommended that they get it, or those who provide essential services. So, a significant amount of percentage of the population, including all nursing staff, are always obliged to receive the influenza vaccine. These are some public health information websites that you can look up and gain more insight into this. The difference between cold and flu. This is the National Microbiology Lab in Canada, where you could get information on infectious disease, different kinds of infectious diseases and the research being done on them and the statistics on them in Canada. This is information about the cold versus a common cold versus the flu and how to recognize the difference. Here, this is coming from the United States. This is the Center for Disease Control and Morbidity and Mortality weekly report, where you can look up the number of cases in the past week that had different reportable diseases and the numbers of death in that week. Here's a mortality associated with flu, and again, more information about the flu, all from the CDC. And here, this is a document that gives you quite a bit of educational information about influenza, the disease, and it's how we protect against it in Canada, in Ontario. It's quite a good publication, and that's why I put it up here. Okay, let's move on and discuss another type of virus that causes respiratory infections, and those are the coronaviruses. Now, coronaviruses have some similarities to flu in that they are RNA viruses. They are enveloped. They do cause a respiratory tract infection, and the infection can range in severity from asymptomatic to mild to fatal, which is also true of the flu, but it is quite a different virus, and it is quite a different disease process. There are 6 known species of coronaviruses that infect humans. One of them is subdivided into 2 different strains. So there are a total of 7 different types or strains that can infect humans. 4 of them have been recognized for quite a while, and they produce a common cold type of symptom. And they're listed here. I wouldn't certainly want you to try and memorize this. Just know that there are 4 species that cause common cold. And then there are 3 types that produce symptoms that can be potentially very severe and fatal, even fatal. 2 are, one is MERS, the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome related coronavirus. The name of the virus is MERS-CoV, which stands for this. And SARS-CoV, which stands for Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome Coronavirus. And then another strain, a different strain of SARS-CoV, which is SARS-CoV-2, which causes COVID-19. So this is Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome Coronavirus 2. These both are the same species, and they're 2 strains of the same species. The diseases they cause are MERS, SARS, and COVID-19. Now, SARS, caused by SARS coronavirus, was first identified in 2003. It's an airborne virus, easily transmitted by breathing in droplets that people release if they're infected by talking, laughing, coughing, sneezing, breathing, and you breathe it in and you get infected in that way. SARS outbreak started in late 2002 and did not end until July 2003, and it actually ended and was contained. There were 8,096 cases in 29 countries that have been identified. People responded quickly, and it's a disease that has a high fatality rate, almost 10%. But although there's a wide range among different groups, if you're in a more susceptible group, the fatality rate goes much higher. So, it was quite successfully contained. People jumped on it very quickly. It was not initially. It was, in fact, it started appearing in China, and the authorities were covering it up. Local authorities covered it up. Even the authorities at a higher level in the government covered it up at first. But it quickly became apparent when it started spreading outside of China. These kind of viral diseases spread quickly because of modern air transport. Symptoms include fever, dry cough, dyspnea, but the outbreak was successfully stopped. However, I have to emphasize that does not mean that the virus cannot or will not reappear and again infect humans. Here are some numbers from different countries where cases had occurred, cases recovered, and deaths. And you can see that in Canada we did have quite a few cases, and most of them were in Toronto. In fact, we had more cases, I believe, than appeared in the United States. Luckily, the response was good. In kind of a twisted way. Luckily, it's severe enough that people recognized it quickly, that it was an urgent situation, and responded quickly enough so that it didn't get a widespread foothold within populations in different countries. But again, it does not mean that it cannot reappear, because it is a virus that can certainly infect animals, and there could be an animal reservoir out there. MERS is another coronavirus, a separate species coronavirus, which causes respiratory disease. The disease is MERS, and it's caused by the MERS-CoV, MERS coronavirus, first identified in 2012. It's a zoonotic infection spreading from camels to humans. There is some human-to-human transmission, but very little. This map shows areas of the world where there have been human-to-human cases, but there are very few of them, and they require very close contact with a severely infected person. So most of them are actually occurring, most of these kind of human-to-human transmissions are occurring in hospitals where there's a severely infected individual passing it on to someone, or within a family group. It can be transmitted, but it's not that simple. It's not that easy from human to human. The spread is from camels to humans, or camel to camel, as you can see. There's lots of areas in the world where they've identified the fact that there are infections in in populations of camels that they've studied. Camel to human transmission has occurred and is believed to be the origin of the infection. And then people who traveled from those areas in the Middle East here, they then spread it to others. They were hospitalized and spread it to other humans. But it has seemingly been more or less contained, although there's still ongoing cases that are being identified. There have, in fact, been 2,500 identified cases in 27 countries. Again, that number reflects the modern feature of everyday life of air transport. Fatality rate is particularly high, 35%. So, it's something that people get quite sick and quickly have fever, dry cough, and shortness of breath, dyspnea. But it's more or less being contained because of the less frequent occurrence of human-to-human transmission. And now we move to another coronavirus, COVID-19, the disease COVID-19 caused by SARS coronavirus 2, second strain, a substrain of SARS coronavirus, first identified in late 2019. First cases identified were in China, although it's still not clear exactly whether they did originate in China or not. At this juncture in time, it's irrelevant. It's spread all over the world, highly transmissible, breathing in small droplets that everyone releases when they breathe and talk. And one particular problem also is that asymptomatic cases, many cases are asymptomatic, but will spread the infection. The cases, in fact, range from asymptomatic to mild to moderate to fatal. So it's a giant problem. From 2019 to November 2020, there have been almost 58 million identified cases, which means that there could be as many as double that, or even more. It's many that were never identified. Time will tell when they do serological studies to look at different populations of people for the presence of antibody, because even the asymptomatic ones will have developed antibodies, so they'll get a better idea of what percentage of the populations did get infected. The only country in the world that denies ever having any cases is North Korea. I should point out that North Korea instituted a shoot-to-kill policy for anyone trying to enter the country illegally. They are scared of it, and it's highly unlikely that they haven't had cases. Fatality rate is 2 to 3%, but when you're talking about such a widespread, highly infectious disease that so many people get, then it's 2 to 3% can be a significant amount. Particularly 2 to 3% of 58 million people. That's over a million. Symptoms include fever, dry cough, and shortness of breath, dyspnea. And the outbreak, this particular outbreak, can only be stopped by following three basic tenets. One is proper preventive measures, which includes wearing masks in all public places, maintaining a proper distance, 2 meters or more, avoiding any place where there are more than just a small number of people, any place where there's several people, especially in a confined space, in a room, in an elevator, etc., it should be avoided. Washing hands after having touched any surface that was accessible to others. If you're at home and you're only touching surfaces that you touched, and then you're okay. But anything else, I mean, to touch an elevator button in a hospital is without washing your hands is it's not a good idea. And avoid touching your face. Those are proper preventive measures that everyone can follow. Development of protective vaccines, which has been successful. That's another requirement for the outbreak to be outbreak of COVID-19 to be stopped in its tracks. And then the third is, and this is just as important as the other two, is public acceptance of the first two that I mentioned, preventive measures and the vaccine itself. If the public does not accept them and does not follow these recommendations and does not people don't get vaccinated, then there will be more and more cases, and unfortunately people will suffer. This is a map showing as of November 22nd, 2020, the areas that have cases. These are the infection rates per 100,000 population. Again, the only place where there is no data is North Korea. That doesn't mean anything. There are cases everywhere in the world, even the most remote islands in the middle of the Pacific or Atlantic have it. There are areas with more than 3,000 cases per 100,000. We in Canada, you can see the breakdown per province. So as I said earlier, by November 2020, the number of confirmed cases worldwide reached 58 million approximately. And 1 year later, that number has increased to 250 million. At this point, a number of effective vaccines were developed, but the vaccines prevent most cases of severe illness, moderate to severe illness, and deaths, but they do not. The vaccines do not prevent actual infection. And so you have asymptomatic individuals or individuals who are not vaccinated, who have been vaccinated, or asymptomatic individuals who have not been vaccinated, and or symptomatic individuals who have not been vaccinated. But in any case, you have people who are still spreading the disease all over the world. And unfortunately, the number of death rates by November 2021 has reached 5 million deaths. Now, this is the situation in Canada, in different provinces. In November 2020, there were 330,000 confirmed cases in Canada. 132,000 of them were in Quebec. And you can see that the incidence of infection varied in terms of accumulated number of cases, varied in different regions. If you look at the statistics in Quebec, you see that with each wave there is an increase in the total number of cases. So with the first wave, there's a rapid increase in the number of cases. As that wave of infections settled back down to a low number of cases, the total number of cases just the slope here just flattens out. There's a slight rise, but then with another wave of infections, another big increase in infections, it rises up again. This, of course, is November 2020. By November 2021, the situation was more peaks, more increases, and the cumulative number of total cases in Quebec had reached 428 by early November 2021. And you can see that there are a significant number of cases all over Canada, over 1.7 million cases total, confirmed cases. So very serious kind of disease, very serious infection, and still something that requires a very high number of, a very high degree of vaccination and good compliance with preventive measures like masks and distancing, and just generally being cautious in order to wipe out the progression of the disease through the population in the country or worldwide.